She belongs to me. Those 3 words were all it took. They fell into a room of rich strangers and a stunned silence followed. They came from a man she had not laid eyes on in 25 years. Those 3 words drained the blood from her ex-husband's face, leaving it pale and shocked. But the detail that will stay with you is this. She never asked for his help. She had no idea he was even there. And before this night is over, she will learn that his protection just made her a target. If you have ever had to force a smile while being humiliated, just to keep the peace, if someone who promised to love you has ever picked you apart piece by piece while a room full of people did nothing, then you know exactly the kind of trap Claire was in, and you have to find out what she does next. Because Claire Donovan is about to find out that the wrong man's affection almost broke her spirit, but the right man's protection might get her killed. The champagne flute hit the floor before Claire Donovan even knew her hand was shaking. It was not the chill in the air or a case of nerves. It was the voice that spoke from right behind her, a voice she had worked for 2 years to erase from her memory. Still trying to save strangers, Claire. His words cut through the elegant New Jersey ballroom, a stiletto wrapped in velvet. They were quiet, sharp, and aimed for a wound only he knew how to open. She made herself turn. Mark Brennan was standing 3 feet from her, holding his own drink, that old half-smile on his lips. It was the same smile that once made her feel safe. Now it just made her feel sick. "This world of charity suits you," he said, his gaze traveling over her simple silver dress, her sensible shoes, her entire life. "You were always so busy fixing other people's problems instead of your own." All around them, golden light from crystal fixtures spilled across marble. The rustle of expensive gowns and the sound of laughter filled the enormous room. It was a winter wedding for the city's elite. This was the kind of gathering where if you were in the room, you had arrived, and if you were not, you never would. Claire lingered at the edge of the celebration, 46 years old and 2 years divorced, suddenly feeling the weight of every gaze that followed the sound of shattered glass. She stooped down to gather the broken pieces. "Do not bother." Mark's voice was loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "The staff will get it. That is what they are for." A woman at the next table quickly looked away, pretending she heard nothing. People always did. Claire rose, her fingers still unsteady, and put on the polite smile she used as a shield. It was the face of a woman who had endured a broken heart, a career change, and the subtle cruelty of men who built themselves up by tearing her down. "Mark," she said, her voice steady. "I am surprised to see you. The Hartleys and I go way back." He took a step toward her. "You remember them, right? From back when we were on the list for parties like this." The insult was perfectly aimed. "You are no longer one of us. You are alone now. This is the life you chose." Claire felt that familiar heaviness return, that old instinct to make herself smaller, to apologize for taking up space, all so he could feel like a bigger man. For so long, she had thought that feeling was a part of love. She knew better now. It was a part of control. "I think they are seating us," she said softly, starting to move toward the dining area. "Leaving so soon?" Mark called after her. "I guess you have not changed at all." She heard a few muffled laughs from a nearby table. Claire's jaw went tight, but she kept walking. She had promised herself she would get through this night. Be polite. Congratulate the happy couple. Leave without a scene. Go back to the small, quiet apartment where she had pieced her life back together, one deliberate choice at a time. But her ex-husband never made anything simple. She found an unoccupied seat at a table by the massive windows, sat down, and let out a long, slow breath. Outside the glass, snow was falling silently in the dark. Inside, the heat and money felt suffocating. She did not fit in this world any longer. Maybe she never really did. "Pardon me." Claire glanced up. A server was standing at her elbow, a silver tray in his hand. On it was a single fresh glass of champagne, which he offered to her. "It is from the gentleman," he explained. "I did not ask for this. He was very specific." Claire let her eyes follow the server's nod across the crowded floor, and her breath caught in her throat. A man was standing by the main entrance, partly concealed by the shadows, staring at her with a focus so intense it felt like the air was thinning. He was tall, with powerful shoulders that strained the fabric of his black suit, a suit so perfectly tailored it looked like a piece of armor. His shirt was open at the neck, no tie. A dark line of ink was just visible on his throat. He offered no smile. He made no gesture. He just met her eyes, and then, with a slow, deliberate purpose, he started walking her way. The crowd seemed to melt away from his path without him ever breaking stride. Claire's heart began to beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She recognized him. She knew that posture, those eyes, that powerful quietness that had always made all the other boys seem noisy and immature. It had been 25 years, back near Spring Lake, during those endless summers when their lives were easy, and the only power that mattered was who could stay underwater the longest. Tony Russo. The name surfaced from a part of her memory she thought was long gone. It felt familiar, a little dangerous, and impossible to grasp. And he was here. He was walking right toward her. Then his shadow covered her table, and her entire plan for the night fell apart. Have you ever been in a crowd while someone you loved tore you down? And you watched as nobody said or did anything to stop it? Have you ever put on a brave face when you were shattering, just to hide how deep the cut really was? If you have, then you know why this exact moment is so important. Tonight, Claire Donovan came to this wedding just hoping to survive it. She never imagined her ex-husband would back her into a corner with his old, familiar brand of cruelty. And she definitely never imagined that a man from a lifetime ago, a man with a dark gaze and a dangerous name, would emerge from the shadows to change the entire game with 3 simple words. But before I tell you what happens, I need you to know this. You were not asking for too much. You were not being difficult. You were not the one with the problem. You were just offering your entire world to a person who only knew how to take parts of it. This story is dedicated to every woman who had to rebuild her own life in private, who kept fighting when she thought no one was paying attention, who used a smile to hide her pain because there was no other option. Your resilience was never invisible. And every once in a while, the world sends someone to show you what you are worth, right at the moment you have started to forget. If you think a woman who pulls herself from the fire deserves to be seen, to be protected, and to be chosen without hesitation, then hit that subscribe and like button for me right now. It takes just 3 seconds. And leave me a comment to tell me if you have ever had someone try to make you feel small in front of other people. I want to know your experience. Now, let us get back to the instant that changes her life. Tony Russo came to a stop next to her chair but did not speak. He did not have to. His silence was more powerful than any announcement. Nearby, chatter faded. People turned their heads to look. The sound of the orchestra seemed to fade into the background, as if the musicians themselves knew that something more significant was happening. Claire looked up into his dark eyes and saw that they were the same after 25 years. They were still calm, still confident, and still held a deep stillness that made her feel exposed. "Tony," she whispered. "Claire." His voice was deep and calm. "It has been a while." She tried to think of something to say, but her mind was blank. The boy she knew from Spring Lake had transformed into something else, a man who wore a black suit like it was made for him and moved through a room of incredible wealth as if he owned it. And for all she knew, he did. The Russo name had become something significant since their childhood. She had caught rumors through the years. They said he ran businesses up and down the Atlantic City coast, that he controlled shipping networks, that his trucks moved produce and goods all over the eastern United States. It was the kind of power that never had to announce itself, because everyone already knew. "May I join you?" he asked, nodding toward the empty seat at her side. She could only nod back, unable to trust her voice to work. Tony did not take the seat across from her. He took the one beside her. It felt like a deliberate choice, a show of solidarity. His leg was so close to hers under the table that she could feel a warmth that made her heart beat faster, a reaction she was not ready to analyze. "You looked like you could use an escape route," he said softly, "but I doubt you would ever ask for one." Claire felt her defenses rise. "I am fine." "I know," he said. The edge of his mouth turned up slightly, not a full smile, but something close. "You always were. That is one of the things I respected about you." Before she could figure out how to reply, another voice broke the spell. "Claire." Mark was standing there, his own glass of champagne in his hand, his smile firmly in place, but his eyes were sharp and calculating. "Are you not going to introduce me to your new associate?" Tony did not get up. He just turned his head slowly and looked at Mark the way someone might look at a piece of dirt on a polished floor. "Tony Russo," he stated. He did not offer a hand. He did not offer any warmth. The name alone was enough. It spread through the nearby tables like a shockwave. Someone nearby quietly pulled out a phone. The balance of power in the room was instantly rearranged, a silent and absolute shift that everyone could feel. Mark's expression tightened at the name. "Russo," he said, drawing out the word. "I know the name. Most people do. And your connection to Claire is what?" Tony's hand moved with deliberate calm, not with speed or aggression. He placed it on the small of her back, his palm a warm, solid presence against the delicate silver fabric of her dress. It was not a claim, nor was it hesitant. It was a line drawn in the sand for everyone to see. "She is with me," Tony stated simply. The three words struck with more force than a shout, more weight than a threat. The large room suddenly felt intimate, as if all the noise had faded, leaving only the sharp reality of that moment. Mark's face went completely still. "With you," he repeated, his voice hollow. "That is what I said. How long has this been going on?" She made her decision. Tony's gaze was unwavering. "Are there any other questions?" Claire felt her breath stop. She knew she should speak up, explain the situation, do something besides sit there under the steady warmth of his hand, but the words would not come. Because after 2 long years, for the first time, she did not feel weak. She felt protected. A sharp, brittle laugh escaped Mark, the sound a man makes when he is searching for a weapon and finds nothing. "I had no idea Claire was aiming so high. The last I knew, she was playing things much safer." Tony's voice lowered, becoming something other than loud or angry. It was far more dangerous. "You and I do not move in the same circles, Brennan. I suggest you remember that." The silence that came after was total. The champagne in Mark's glass shook. His expression shifted from rage to calculation, then to fear, before settling on a look of hurried retreat. "Enjoy the wedding," Tony said, his tone already dismissing him. Mark offered no argument. He simply turned and vanished into the crowd, like someone who just remembered they were needed somewhere else. Someone who is right for you will not ask you to become smaller. They will give you the room you need to grow. Never forget that. Claire let out a long, slow breath. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then Tony's hand gently lifted from her back, giving her space. "You did not need to do that for me," Claire said softly. "I am aware." "Then why did you?" Tony met her eyes. He truly saw her. It was the same way he used to look at her when they were kids, when the future felt both endless and out of reach. "Because you deserve to have someone who would." A tightness formed in Claire's chest. From across the grand room, she could feel Mark's stare. He had not looked away, and for some reason, that unsettled her more than anything else. If you have ever had someone stand up for you when everyone was watching, or even just wished that they would, then you understand why this is so important. Go ahead and hit the subscribe button, because the story between Claire and Tony is about to change everything. And if you are watching by yourself tonight, leave a comment. I want to know you are here with us. Tony guided her toward a less crowded part of the ballroom, away from the hum of prying eyes. He held a chair for her before taking the one beside her, not opposite her. Claire noticed the small detail immediately. Mark had always put a table between them, a desk, a whole room, using formality to create a chasm. Tony closed that gap without a thought, establishing them as partners in whatever this was. "You are staring at me," he observed. "I am trying to understand," Claire replied, shaking her head. 25 years, Tony. One day you were gone after that summer by Spring Lake, and now you are… this." She made a slight gesture toward him. The perfectly fitted suit, the immense calm, the way the entire event seemed to pivot around him. "You know exactly what you are," she said without accusation. "Do not try to deny it." A muscle in Tony's jaw flexed, a tiny signal she caught. "I am a man of business," he stated. "My family is involved in distribution, food supply, logistics. We handle the networks that keep grocery stores full and restaurants supplied. Everything else is just talk." He held her gaze steadily. "People will always talk. Most of what you hear is not real. Some of it is. I stopped trying to correct them a long time ago." Claire watched him. This boy who once trapped lightning bugs in glass jars, now surrounded by influence and secrets she could not define. "What are you doing here tonight, Tony?" He did not hesitate. "I saw your name on the list of guests." The simple words landed like a gentle shock. "You came here for me." "I was not going to come," he confessed. "But then I saw your name, and I decided it was time." "Time for what?" Tony paused for a long moment, choosing his words. When he finally spoke, his tone was softer. "I found out about your divorce, about what Brennan did." His expression darkened. "I heard that he made your life difficult, both in your work and with your friends. That for 2 years, he made sure everyone believed you were the one who left him, and not the other way around." Claire's throat felt tight. "You have been following what happens to me." "Not closely," he clarified. "Just enough." He leaned in a little. "I understand what it feels like to be judged unfairly, Claire. To have other people write your story for you. I thought," he paused, "maybe you could use someone on your side tonight. Someone who knew you before any of this happened." She felt the burn of tears and fought them back. "I spent 2 years putting my life back together," she told him, her voice low. "My career, my consulting business, my own identity separate from anyone else." "I know," he said. "I do not need a hero, Tony. I know that as well." A real smile touched his lips for the first time. "That is precisely why I am here." They spoke for what felt like an hour, not about his reputation or his business, but about easy things. They talked about summers at the beach and parents gone too soon. They talked about the strange feeling of hitting middle age and not quite recognizing the person in the mirror. Tony was a better listener than a talker. When Claire described rebuilding her business from scratch after the divorce, the sleepless nights, the clients she lost, the slow fight to prove her worth again, his jaw set with a look of deep understanding. "You did that all by yourself," he stated. "I had no other choice. A lot of people would have quit. I am not a lot of people." The look in his eyes changed then, respect turning into something deeper. "No," he said, his voice quiet. "You never were." On the other side of the ballroom, the musicians changed to a slow melody. A wave of applause followed. As couples moved to the dance floor, Mark Brennan walked toward the microphone at the front of the room. A cold feeling settled in Claire's stomach. "What is he about to do?" she whispered. Tony followed her gaze, his eyes becoming sharp and analytical. "He is about to make a mistake," he said quietly. The sound system crackled. "May I have your attention, please?" Mark's voice, smooth and confident, filled the space. "I would like to make a toast." Claire's hands gripped the table's edge. Tony saw it. "No matter what comes next," he said, his voice low and for her alone, "you will not go through it by yourself." She turned to look at him, this man who had stepped out of her history and into this moment with impossible timing. "Why do I believe you?" she breathed. Tony's hand covered hers under the table. "Because some things never change, Claire." At the front, Mark lifted his glass. "To love," he started, his gaze sweeping the crowd until it locked onto Claire. "And to understanding when it is time to let go." Tony's hand tightened on hers as Claire understood she would not be able to sit through this. Mark Brennan held the microphone like it was a weapon. "To love," he said again, his voice echoing in the silent ballroom. "The genuine kind. The kind that understands when to fight and when to surrender." He stared directly at Claire from across the room. "A few of us have had to learn that lesson the hard way," he went on, his smile growing wider. "You invest everything in a person. Your energy, your money, your whole future, only for them to leave because they think they can do better. As if loyalty has no value. As if the past never happened." A low murmur spread through the guests. Claire felt a hot blush of humiliation and anger rise in her face. "But that is the great thing about a wedding, is it not?" Mark raised his glass even higher. "It is a reminder that true love lasts, that a good woman supports her man through everything." The message was unmistakable. Claire was not a good woman. Claire was a failure. Claire was the warning. Next to her, Tony became perfectly still. "To the happy couple," Mark concluded. "May they avoid the errors that some of the rest of us have made." Glasses were raised amid thin applause and the uneasy chuckles of people who knew precisely what he had just done. Claire's vision swam. 2 years. She had spent 2 years rebuilding her life, proving her own worth, learning to be independent, and Mark had just turned it all into a joke in front of the entire world she worked in. She began to stand, needing to run, to be anywhere else. But Tony was already on his feet. He did not ask for the microphone. He did not have to. "I agree," he said. His voice was calm and steady, but it sliced through the dying applause like steel. Every head in the room turned. All other sound ceased. The world shrank to the space around them. Mark stood frozen, the microphone still in his hand. "To walk away from something that makes you less," Tony continued, his gaze sweeping the crowd before landing on Mark, "is a sign of wisdom. It requires real courage to leave what you know, especially when you finally see it has been shrinking you instead of helping you grow." He moved to stand closer to Claire, not touching her, but his presence was a shield. "She did not lose a thing," Tony said, his quiet voice carrying to every corner of the room. "She chose to save herself. That is not weakness, that is survival." The room fell into a deep, heavy quiet. It was the kind of quiet that changes things for good. Then a sound. Clapping. It started awkwardly with one person in the back. Then another joined, and soon it was a rolling wave of applause that filled the entire space. Mark stood at the front, completely still. He was vulnerable in a way his money could never fix. The smile on his face twisted into something ugly, a mask breaking apart for everyone to see. Tears streamed down Claire's face, but they were tears of relief, not shame. Tony placed his hand on the small of her back. His touch was gentle and steady. He leaned in and whispered so only she could hear, "Breathe. It is finished." Claire looked over at Mark and saw the cold anger hardening in his eyes. She knew this was not finished at all. This was only the beginning. Mark put the microphone down but did not move. He just watched her. His expression was patient and calculating, like a hunter. Claire understood that his next move would not be in front of everyone. It would be somewhere private, in the shadows. It would be when she was by herself, and Tony Russo would not be around to protect her. "Let me ask you something. Have you ever been shamed in public by a person who was supposed to care about you? Have you felt your face burn while the people around you looked away? If you have, then you understand what Claire feels in this moment. But here is the truth. Most people do not get someone like Tony Russo to step in. Most people have to endure that kind of cruelty by themselves. So if this story gives you anything, whether it is hope or just the deep satisfaction of seeing a man like Mark get what he deserves, please subscribe and like this video. You need to stay with me, because what he does next will leave you breathless. 20 minutes passed before Claire made an excuse to leave the table. "I need a minute," she said. Her voice was surprisingly firm. "I just need some fresh air." Tony looked at her closely. "I can go with you." She forced a weak smile. I will be all right. The ladies' room is right down that hall. I will be back in 5 minutes. He paused for a moment. A look that was almost like worry crossed his face, but then he agreed. 5 minutes, he said. After that, I am coming to get you. Claire moved away from the table, making her way through the guests toward the hallway. The sounds of the party, the music and the laughter, began to fade behind her until they were just a muffled hum. The corridor was cool and quiet. Oil paintings in gold frames hung on the cream-colored walls, and the lights cast long, dark shadows. She rested her hand on the wall to steady herself and took a deep breath. The evening had turned into something so much bigger than she could have imagined. After 2 years of everyone believing Mark's lies, Tony Russo had shown up and defended her. It felt unreal. It felt incredibly dangerous. That was quite a show back there. Claire's entire body went cold. Mark appeared from a dark corner, blocking her way back to the party. His tie was loose and his hair was out of place. The polished look was gone, replaced by something raw and hateful. Mark, she began. He moved toward her. Was this your plan? To bring him here and make a fool out of me? He demanded. I did not know he would be here. You are a liar, he hissed, taking another step. You were always so good at pretending to be the victim. Poor Claire. She married a man who gave her the world, but she was too fragile for a real life, so she ran away. I am not having this conversation with you. She tried to walk around him. He grabbed her wrist with a painful grip. You think he makes you special? Mark sneered, yanking her toward him. You think some street tough in an expensive suit changes who you are? You will always be a weak woman who needs a man, Claire. There was a sudden, sharp sound that stopped his words. 1 second, Mark's hand was crushing her wrist and his face was full of rage. The next, he was slammed hard against the wall. Tony's arm was pressed against his neck with calm, terrifying force. It was not enough to stop his breathing, just enough to deliver a message that would last a lifetime. You put your hands on her. Tony's voice was calm, almost casual, which made it far more frightening. Mark's eyes grew wide. All his confidence vanished in an instant. I was just... You put your hands on her, Tony said again. After all the pain you caused her, you thought you could trap her in a hallway and touch her. Russo, just listen to me. I do not give warnings, Brennan, Tony said, leaning in closer. His voice dropped to a near whisper. I correct problems, so I am going to be extremely clear. If you talk to her again, if you even look at her for too long, or if you breathe in a way that makes her feel unsafe, I will find out, and I will deal with it. Do you understand me? Mark nodded his head up and down, terrified. Say the words. I understand. Good. Tony let him go. Mark stumbled back, grabbing at his throat. His eyes darted from Tony to Claire, like a cornered animal looking for a way out. He saw the hallway that led to the parking lot and ran without a single look back. The corridor was silent again. Tony immediately turned to Claire, and all the hardness in his body softened. He looked almost vulnerable. Are you okay? She shook her head no, but her hands were trembling as she rubbed the red mark on her wrist. Claire. Tony came closer and gently lifted her chin so she had to look at him. Are you hurt? No, she whispered. I am fine. You are shaking. I know. A brittle laugh escaped her. I am not scared of him, Tony. I am scared of... She trailed off. Tony stood there, waiting. I am scared of how easily you did that, she finally said. How simple it seemed for you. How much more you could have done if you had really wanted to. A shadow of something passed through his eyes. It was a mix of pain and understanding. I know, he said, his voice soft. I know what you saw. And I know what that makes you think about me. Claire felt a tightness in her chest. Let me drive you home, Tony offered. We can talk on the way, or we can just be quiet, whatever you want. She looked at this man who had been her protector, her defender, and her terror all in one night. She made a choice that felt like jumping from a great height. Okay, she whispered. The car was a sleek black machine that moved in complete silence. Tony drove with his hands firm on the steering wheel, his gaze locked on the dark road that cut through the New Jersey winter. Snowflakes danced in the headlights for a moment before vanishing into the night. Claire sat beside him, the silver fabric of her dress gathered around her. She watched the world outside become a blur. She knew she should feel scared, but she did not. Or perhaps she felt so many different kinds of fear that they had all blended together into one numb feeling. "Just ask me," Tony said without looking at her. Claire turned to him. "Ask you what?" "Whatever it is you need to know. Whatever is building up behind your eyes." He gave her a quick glance. "I would prefer you ask the questions instead of just wondering about the answers." She was quiet for a while, trying to put her chaotic thoughts in order. "If you could do that to him," she finally began, her voice cautious. "What happens the next time someone angers you? What happens when you believe someone deserves more than just a warning?" Tony did not try to avoid the question. "I handle it," he answered plainly. "I do whatever is necessary." "And if I told you to stop?" "Then I would stop," he said, meeting her eyes with a brief, powerful stare. "For you, I would." Claire's breathing hitched. "You want me to just believe that," she said, "to believe that you can control your own nature." "I am not asking you to believe anything." His voice was solid and sure. "I am telling you who I am. I am telling you the things I have done and what I am willing to do, and I am letting you be the one to decide if that is a person you can be around." The car filled with silence again. "I have known so many men who pretended to be something they were not," Claire said softly. "Mark was charming until he turned cruel. He was generous until he made me feel like I owed him. He was loving until I disagreed with him." Tony remained quiet. "You are not pretending, are you?" she went on. "You are showing me everything, and somehow that is scarier than any lie." "I am done pretending," Tony said. "With you, I do not want to pretend." He turned onto her street. It was a quiet road with trees and houses that had warm, glowing lights in the windows. "I have done many things that I cannot undo, Claire, but I have never kept someone who wanted to be free. I never would." He brought the car to a stop in front of her home. Neither of them made a move to get out. "I do not know what this is," Claire said at last. "I do not know what tonight meant, or what happens now." "I do not know either," Tony said, turning his body to face her. "But I want to find out. We can do it your way, at your speed. You set the rules." She studied his face, searching for any sign of a trick or a hidden agenda. She saw nothing but his steady gaze and an expression that seemed almost hesitant. Tony Russo hesitant. That felt more truthful than any promise he could have made. She murmured a quiet goodnight to Tony. He said her name Claire in return. Her silver dress shimmered under the lights of her building as she stepped from the vehicle. At the entrance, she glanced back. He was still there, his gaze fixed on her, just waiting. She gave a slight wave. He offered a single nod. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving Claire Donovan alone inside her silent apartment. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Her thoughts were a chaotic storm. Had she just made the best choice of her life, or had she invited in the greatest danger? A whisper echoed in her mind. Men like Tony Russo were not accidents. They did not protect strangers because of a distant summer memory, and they never made a promise they would not fulfill. As she watched his car fade into the darkness from her window, she knew. This was not a rescue. It was a doorway into a world she could not comprehend, offered by a man she was not certain she could ever trust. And for the first time in 2 years, Claire Donovan was not certain she wanted to refuse. Did you hear that? She is not certain she wants to refuse. After all of it, the terror, the doubt, watching him hold her ex-husband against a wall, a part of her still wants to stay. If you have ever been drawn to someone who was clearly wrong for you, someone who terrified you and made you feel protected all at once, you get it. This has nothing to do with logic. It never does. So I am asking you, have you ever wanted to agree to something your brain screamed at you to escape? Put it in the comments. Be real. I need to know. 3 weeks went by before Claire Donovan finally used her phone. It was not for a lack of thinking about him. He occupied her thoughts constantly. He was there during her morning coffee, in the quiet moments between work calls, and in the long, sleepless hours of the night. Her mind kept replaying his every word, his every look, the brief pressure of his hand on her back. Tony Russo. The name itself felt heavier now, more substantial. She had looked him up online naturally. She found the articles that hinted at ugly truths without ever stating them. She saw the pictures from fundraisers and formal events, where he always stood just a little separate from everyone else, an observer more than a participant. The official record called him a businessman. The whispers on the street told a very different tale. But it was the memory of his voice in that hallway, so quiet and controlled and frightening, that stole her sleep. And it was the memory of his vow in the car that finally made her make the call. If I ever make you afraid, you walk away, and I will let you go. The phone only rang twice before he answered. Claire. His voice was warm, and he did not sound surprised, almost like he had been expecting her. I have been thinking, she began. Me too, he said. I do not know what this is, Tony. I do not know if calling you is the mistake, or if waiting so long to call was the real error. The line was silent. It was not an awkward silence, but a patient one. I want to see you again, she finally said, but on my conditions. A neutral place, not a wedding, not a hallway, and not inside your car. Just name it. She had already planned for this. A place public enough for safety. A place quiet enough for a real conversation. Lambertville, she said. There is a coffee shop on Bridge Street. Saturday, in the afternoon. I will be there. Tony. Yes. She hesitated, trying to find the correct words. I am not agreeing to anything. I just want to understand who you are now, and what you are looking for, and if any of this can possibly make sense. That is all I want, he replied softly. A chance for you to understand. And then the call was over. Claire sat in her apartment, the phone still warm against her skin, and feared she had just unlocked something that could never be contained again. Saturday was overcast and cold. Winter in Lambertville was a quiet affair. The antique stores were mostly empty. The Delaware River was a stark line between bare trees, and the streets had the unique stillness of a small town biding its time until spring. Tony was already inside when she got there. He was at a table in the corner, his coffee untouched, his eyes on the door. When he saw her walk in, his expression changed. It might have been relief, or possibly something that looked like hope. He rose from his chair as she came closer. You made it, he said. I told you I would. People say many things. She chose the seat across from him, creating a space between them. He saw it, but did not comment. They spoke for 2 hours. They did not talk about influence or business or the dark reputation that followed his name. They talked about small things, like books they had both enjoyed, places they had been, and the odd feeling of getting to middle age only to find the life you have is not the one you once pictured. Tony was a listener more than a talker. When Claire started talking about her job helping healthcare companies become more efficient, he became intensely focused. You fix broken things, he observed. I try to. That requires a special kind of patience, he said, to see a problem and believe you can make it right. Is that your job too? She asked, choosing her words with care. Fixing things? A muscle in his jaw flexed. I get rid of problems. That is different. No, she admitted in a low voice. It is not. But the frankness of his reply made her trust him a little more, not less. As the staff began to close the cafe, Tony escorted her to her car. He made no move to kiss her. He did not ask for another date. He just stood there in the dim winter light, hands in his pockets, and waited. Next Saturday, Claire heard herself say, same time. The smile that appeared on his face was slight, but it was real. I will be here. She drove away as the afternoon light failed, and for the first time in 3 weeks, The knot of anxiety in her stomach loosened. It was not gone, but it was looser, and that somehow scared her more than anything else, because she was beginning to learn that feeling safe felt an awful lot like free-falling. 6 weeks after that wedding, Mark Brennan's life started to come apart at the seams. It began with small things. A major contract was suddenly canceled with no good reason. A business partner backed out of a deal overnight. A loan was denied by a bank that had given him money a dozen times in the past. Mark claimed it was just bad luck, a downturn in the market, unfortunate timing. But then his phone stopped ringing. The social invitations dried up. The associates who once eagerly laughed at his stories now had scheduling conflicts, sudden emergencies, and other business to attend to. Claire learned about it through gossip, hushed tones at work events, and cautious remarks from friends they shared, people who now seemed nervous to even speak his name. Did you hear about Brennan? He lost the Morrison account. His company is hemorrhaging money. Someone said he has been blacklisted, but no one can say by who. She sat at her desk, staring blankly at her computer screen, a cold dread spreading through her. This was not bad luck. This was calculated. This was deliberate. She did not meet with Tony that week. He sent short, kind texts asking how she was, but he never pushed for her time. She replied with caution, maintaining a separation she was not sure she actually wanted. Then, on Thursday night, her phone rang. "Have dinner with me," Tony said. "Saturday. I know a place near Spring Lake you might enjoy." Spring Lake. The place where they had spent those summers so long ago, when life had felt so much easier. "Okay," she agreed. The restaurant was intimate and refined. It had white tablecloths, candlelight, and large windows that looked out on the dark winter sea. Tony had secured a private table for them in the back, far from any prying eyes. They placed their orders and talked. The conversation came more easily now, resting on the comfort they had built during their afternoons in Lambertville. Yet there was a heavy topic between them, one Claire could no longer avoid. "Mark Brennan," she said in a low voice. Tony's expression remained unchanged. "What about him?" she asked. "His entire world is collapsing. His business, his name, all of it. I heard something about that." "Tony." She leaned in closer. "Was this your doing?" He placed his fork down and looked directly at her. "Yes." The word was a single, heavy drop in a silent pond. "Why?" she asked, though she felt she already had the answer. "Because he put his hands on you." Tony's voice was perfectly level. "Objective. Because for 2 years he tried to ruin you. Because men like that never quit until they are forced to. I never asked you for this. No, you did not. So why did you do it?" "Because I was able to." He held her gaze, not even blinking. "Because I am in a position to create real consequences for men who believe they are above them. And because when I saw him back you into that corner in the hallway." He paused, his jaw tight. "I made a choice." Claire's hands were shaking as she held her wine glass. "This is what you do," she said, speaking slowly. "This is the man you are. Yes. And if I told you to stop?" Tony was silent for a very long time. "If you told me to stop, I would," he said at last. "But Claire, he will not stop. Men like Brennan do not learn their lesson from kindness. They learn from losing, from being afraid, and from realizing that their choices have a price they cannot pay." She stared at him. This man had stood up for her, shielded her, and then systematically destroyed her ex-husband's life without ever being asked. "I need some time to think," she whispered. "Take all the time you need." They ate the rest of their meal mostly in silence. Tony drove her back to her apartment. He did not touch her, did not pressure her, and did not ask for anything she was not prepared to offer. At her door she faced him. "I do not know if I can handle this," she told him. "I do not know if I can be with a man who I understand." His voice was soft. "I'm not asking for an answer tonight." She went into her apartment, closed the door, and stood there in the complete darkness. She was trying to fit the two pieces of him together, the man who had been so incredibly tender with her, and the man who had just confessed to ruining another person. The truly awful part was that she could not decide which one of them scared her more, or which one she was starting to love. She returned to his house the very next night. The same home stood behind the same iron gates, with the same warm light pushing back against the winter blackness. This time, when Tony opened the door, he looked utterly spent. A deep worry lined his face, as if he had passed the night just as she had, awake and wondering if he had lost her forever. "You came back," he said, his voice quiet. "I needed to tell you something." He led her back to the sitting room. A fire was already burning in the hearth. He had been waiting for her. Claire did not take a seat this time either. She stood by the fireplace, gathering her strength. "I am not afraid of you," she said at last. Something shifted in Tony's expression. "I thought I was," she explained, "after what happened in that hallway, after discovering what you did, after I heard you threaten to end him permanently if he ever tried anything." She paused, taking a steadying breath. "I thought the fear meant I had to run, but now I finally understand. I was never afraid of you at all." She turned to face him directly. "I was afraid of myself. I was terrified of what it means that I am drawn to a man who lives in the shadows. I was scared that wanting you meant I was a party to things I could never control." Tony was completely still. "But I have spent my entire life trying to control everything," Claire said. "Mark, my job, my image, how people perceived me. And what did it get me? 2 years of my life spent rebuilding after a man who swore he loved me, chose to destroy me." "Claire, let me finish." She moved a step closer to him. "I do not want to be protected if it means I lose my voice. I refuse to be with someone who makes decisions about my life for me. I will not wake up one day to find I have just swapped one form of control for another. I would never do that." "I know." She reached out, her fingers gently touching his jaw. "I know that now. Because you told me the truth about yourself. Even when the truth was ugly. Even when you knew it could make me leave." Tony's hand rose to cover hers, his touch warm and firm. "What are you trying to say?" he asked. "I am saying that I want to try, whatever this thing between us is. But you have to understand something first. I am not some prize you need to protect. I am not a problem for you to solve. I am a woman who has spent 46 years learning how to stand up for herself, and I am not giving that up for anyone. I would never ask you to." "Then stay," she said, her voice softening. "But stay next to me. Not in front of me. Not behind me. Beside me." Tony's gaze scanned her face, searching for a hint of doubt, a trace of hesitation, any signal that she did not mean every word. He saw nothing but resolve. "Claire Donovan," he said, his voice slow and deliberate. "For my whole life, I have been surrounded by people who wanted something I could provide. Power, money, influence, protection." His thumb gently stroked her cheekbone. "You are the first person in 20 years who has looked at the entirety of who I am and asked me to stand with you. Not over you, not under you, beside you. Is that a yes?" "It is a promise." He leaned in, letting his forehead rest against hers. "Wherever this leads, whatever comes our way, I will never do anything to make you feel small. I will never make a choice about your life without you. And if you ever, for any reason, feel afraid of me, you tell me, and we will face it together." She kissed him, softly at first, and then with more depth. They were two people who had built walls their entire lives, and they were finally letting those walls crumble. When they pulled apart, tears were streaming down Claire's face, not from sorrow, but from pure relief. "This is crazy," she whispered. "Probably. I hardly know you. We can take our time. What if this does not work out?" Tony smiled, and it was the first genuine smile she had ever seen from him. "Then we will have tried, and that is more than most people can say." Outside, the snow started to fall. Inside, two souls who had found one another across decades of distance and damage began to build something that seemed impossible, yet felt like the only thing that was ever meant to be. Spring arrived slowly in New Jersey that year. The snow vanished in patches, uncovering ground that had been frozen solid for months. The trees began to bud with caution, as if they were unsure that winter had truly ended. The entire world seemed to be holding its breath, just waiting. In that time of waiting, Claire and Tony built something together. It was careful, it was deliberate, and it was honest. They took a drive to the Delaware Water Gap one Sunday morning and walked the trails that twisted through forests, still stripped bare by winter. They talked about absolutely everything. His childhood spent near the coast, her years spent building a career that Mark almost completely ruined, and the strange, separate journeys that had somehow brought them both to the same wedding on the same night. "I was not even planning to go," Tony confessed. He had stopped at a viewpoint that looked down on the river as it snaked through the valley below. "The Hartleys are just business contacts. I normally just send a gift instead of showing up." "What made you change your mind?" "Your name was on the guest list." He turned to face her. "I saw it, and something just fell into place. It was like the universe was offering me a single opportunity to do something I should have done 25 years ago. And what was that? To tell you how I felt about you." His eyes locked with hers. "Back then, I was just some kid from a messy family, and you were this girl whose laugh made the world seem like it made sense. I did not have the words to say what that meant to me. But I do now." Claire reached out and took his hand. "This is real," she said, her voice low. "Is it not? It is not just the adrenaline from that night. It is not just some fantasy about what could have been. It is real." Tony squeezed her fingers. "It is as real as anything I have ever known." They stood there together on the edge of the cliff, looking out at the world stretching beneath them. And for the first time in so long, Claire felt something she had nearly forgotten was possible. Peace. Her consulting firm made a full comeback that spring. The clients who had kept their distance during the divorce started to quietly return. The number of referrals went up. Her work in the healthcare and wellness sector grew into new markets. She began working with hospital networks, rehabilitation facilities, and companies that needed an expert who understood both the medical and the business sides of the industry. She did not know if Tony had played a part in it. She did not ask him. She was starting to learn that some things did not need to be analyzed so closely. Some things you just had to accept. They settled into a routine. They spent weekends together, talked on the phone during the week, and had dinner at quiet little restaurants where nobody knew who they were or what their pasts held. Tony never pushed her to go faster. He never asked for more than she was willing to give. And slowly, with great care, Claire Donovan started to trust again. Not without question, not without limits, but it was enough. On a warm evening in late May, she stood at the window of Tony's house with a warm cup of coffee in her hands, watching the sun disappear behind the trees. He came and stood behind her, close enough for her to feel his body heat, but with enough space that she never felt cornered. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "I was thinking that I spent 2 years convinced I had to rebuild my life all by myself." She turned to face him. That asking for help was a sign of weakness. That needing someone meant I would lose who I was. "And now? Now I am standing here in your house, wearing your shirt, and wondering how I could have been so afraid of something that feels so right for so long." Tony's hand came up to cup her cheek. "You are not afraid anymore." "I am terrified," she said with a soft laugh. "But I am not afraid of you. I am afraid of how much I want this to succeed, of how much I have allowed myself to feel again, of what might happen if... If what?" She paused for a moment. "If your world finally comes for us. If the version of you that I do not get to see comes knocking on our door." Tony's jaw clenched. "It might," he admitted. "I am not going to lie to you. The life I have made for myself comes with consequences, with enemies, With problems I cannot always see coming. And what if it does? Then we will handle it together. He drew her closer. That is what beside me means, Claire. It is not just for the easy parts, it is for all of it. She kissed him slowly, with purpose. It was a choice she was making with her eyes wide open. Then I am staying, she said against his mouth. Good. But Tony. Yes. If it ever gets to be too much, if I ever feel like I am getting lost in your shadows, you will tell me, he finished for her, and we will figure it out together. She nodded. Outside, the last bit of light vanished from the sky. Inside, two people who had chosen one another against all odds held on to something that felt both delicate and everlasting at the very same time. 6 months later, Claire opened her eyes to sunlight pouring through windows she had started to consider her own. Tony's side of the bed was empty, but the sheets were still warm. She could hear him downstairs, the quiet sounds of his morning routine, the coffee maker brewing, the low murmur of a phone conversation. She stretched and smiled, allowing herself to feel a sense of contentment. Her business was booming. 3 different hospital networks had signed contracts just in the last quarter. Her professional reputation was completely restored. Mark had moved to Florida, a diminished figure who was no longer a threat. She found Tony in the kitchen with his phone held to his ear, his expression impossible to read. Understood, he said quietly. Keep me updated. He hung up, put the phone down, and looked at her. Good morning, Claire said. She reached for the cup of coffee he had already poured for her. Is everything all right? Just business. His smile was a little strained. It did not quite reach his eyes. It is nothing you need to be concerned about. But something in his tone gave her pause. Tony. It is handled. He walked over to her and kissed her on the forehead. I promise. She looked closely at his face, at the tightness in his jaw and the shadow behind his gaze. You would tell me if it was not handled, she said. Right? If there was a problem? Always. She believed him. For the most part. They ate breakfast out on the patio and spoke of normal things. There was a charity gala next week, a planned trip to the shore, her business meeting later that afternoon. It was normal. It was peaceful. It was everything she had spent years thinking she could never have again. But the memory of that phone call lingered. The look on his face when he had noticed her standing in the doorway. The subtle way he had shifted his body, as if to conceal what he was feeling. Tony Russo did not keep secrets from her. That was the foundation of their agreement from the very beginning. But every person had their limits. Every person had shadows they were unable to share. He lied to her with a kiss. That is the only injustice that matters. It began a normal afternoon when she left, believing his promise that he would be right there when she got back. But she saw the lie in the rearview mirror. It was in the sad way he stood in the doorway, hand raised in a silent goodbye. This is what it means to be powerless. To feel a warning in your bones and ignore it for the sake of trust. Real power is supposed to protect the ones you love. So what happens when it hides the truth instead? Stay with me to find out. The house was quiet when she returned. Too quiet. She called his name and only silence answered. Then she saw him. Tony appeared from his office, his face a perfect mask. He asked about her day, but his eyes were somewhere else. The cold knot in her stomach tightened. Tell me what is wrong, she demanded. He insisted it was nothing. For the first time, she called him a liar. She watched his jaw clench, saw him look away. He admitted there was a problem, a ghost from a life he swore was buried. He promised it was under control. What kind of ghost? She asked. His answer chilled her to the bone. The kind I swore would never find you. She looked into his eyes. This was the man who had shown her his deepest scars. The man who had promised her he would never try to make her small. He had earned her trust over 6 long months. So she gave it to him one more time. Yes, she whispered. I trust you. The relief that washed over his face was absolute. He pulled her into his arms and held her like she was an anchor in a raging storm. He thanked her, his voice thick with emotion. In the fading light, they stood as two people who had built a life in an impossible world. Claire believed they would be okay. She had to. She told herself their love was stronger than any shadow. Later, as he slept beside her, his phone lit up the darkness. A single buzz, a single message from a number she did not recognize. Her eyes focused on the screen. 3 simple words appeared. He is coming back. The warmth in her veins turned to ice. She looked at Tony's peaceful face, then back at the phone. The truth hit her with perfect, terrible clarity. The safety they had built was an illusion. The past he swore would never touch her was now reaching for her throat. Someone was out there, moving through the darkness, and they were coming for him. Claire stared at the ceiling, her heart hammering against her ribs. She did not wake him up. She let him sleep. In the suffocating darkness of the room, she made a vow. She would not run. She had spent a lifetime running from men who wanted to own her, to break her. That life was over. She was done running from the dark. She was done running from the truth. She would stand and face this, for the man who had given her the one thing she never knew she needed, the right to choose her own fight. In the quiet of the New Jersey night, the pieces were already moving on the board. Claire Donovan was about to learn a hard lesson. Loving a man like Tony Russo meant accepting his demons, but it also meant fighting them with him. True power is meant to protect, but his silence had put her in danger. Now, justice would have to come from two imperfect people against a threat they could not yet see. Some promises, once broken, can never be fixed, and the past was about to knock their door down. If you have followed Claire this far, through the pain and the hope and the incredible choice to love a dangerous man, then you already know a fundamental truth. You know that courage is not about being fearless. It is about planting your feet when everything inside you is screaming to run. It is about standing your ground. It is about believing that you are worthy of a love that can withstand any storm. It is a lesson most people never get to learn. Here is the truth you need to remember when this story is over. A woman who rises from her own ashes never has to apologize for the space she takes up. The ones who hurt you do not get to write your ending. You do. You are not too much. You are not too loud. You are not difficult. You are the light, and you gave it to someone living in the shadows. The right person will never try to dim you. They will stand with you and make you feel powerful enough to take on the world. If this story feels familiar, it is because that strength is already inside you. It is yours, and nobody can take it away. Claire finally found a love like that, but now they have to see if it is strong enough to survive. Subscribe this second. Make sure your notifications are on, because the second part is coming soon. You do not want to be the one who misses what happens when the past kicks in the door. Claire Donovan will have to decide how far she will go to protect the man she loves. Some people fight for love. This love might demand she die for it. See what happens next. Our team spent countless hours researching, writing, and editing this story to deliver a powerful message that we hope will resonate with you. We are grateful that you chose to spend your time with us on this journey.